Continuation of interview with Sir Denis Wright on the 11th of October 1984 in Haddam. Interviewers Habib, لاجوردی. Sir Denis, if we could continue today's session by asking you to describe your visit to Iran. I believe it was in 1977. That was your first sort of visit with your old friends and acquaintances?
No, I went back twice before that after I retired. I went back two, even perhaps three times. And I think I saw the Shah on every occasion. But the most interesting one was the return I made there in 1977, April. I went out primarily to, I was on my way back from the Far East, but I was mainly concerned with launching my book, the English Amongst the Persians, which had come out, and I was going to sign copies and that sort of thing, and there was quite a lot of publicity in the press, but unfortunately 100 copies which were sent by air had arrived, but the 1,000 copies ordered by the bookseller were held up at the Turkish frontier. And so when I went down to my first session of signing on, there was a large queue of people, 100 or more, already before 9:30 when the bookshop opened. And within three-quarters of an hour, I'd signed 100 copies, and that was that. And then people started queuing up the next 2 or 3 days, and there was nothing for them. So that was my main purpose in going to Iran. But I saw the Shah and had a long, an hour's talk, I suppose, with him on general things. Although I was a director of Shell and the Imperial Standard Chartered Bank, I wasn't talking any business with him at all. I was merely giving him a copy of my book, which he had apparently had favourable reports on. In fact, the Minister of Court had bought up 2,000 copies to distribute at the 50th anniversary of the Pahlavi foundation, Pahlavi dynasty. And so he knew about the book and was complimentary about it. And he ranged over the whole wide field of international affairs and, as usual, had a firm grasp of the situation, was worried about what was happening in Afghanistan. He was worried about Ethiopia even. He was Somaliland, and looked at it in a broad world perspective, but he was not at all worried apparently about the internal situation. He had nothing to say of any interest on the internal situation. As usual, he had a complaint about the BBC and the Economist. I don't know whether Times came into it, but I knew he was very upset about something the BBC had said. I've forgotten what it was. And I counterattacked because shortly before I went to Iran, there had been a very nasty article in the English edition of Kayhan International, I think it was. It may have been in Etalat also. But this was an article attacking Sir Roger Stevens, one of my predecessors in Tehran, on the grounds that he had written an article in the Spectator, the weekly paper, which the Shah regarded as unfavourable. Well, I had heard about this article in the Spectator, and in fact I heard about it from the Iranian ambassador in London, Parviz Raji, who had telephoned me. I think the article appeared in February of 19... had telephoned me about some other matter. I think it was a question of Weidenfeld, the publisher, was tried to get him to agree to get the Shah, write a biography about the Shah, and Raji had phoned me up to ask whether I thought this was a good idea. And I told him I thought it would be a very silly idea, because anything said about the Shah in order to please the Shah would be purely propaganda and would be self-defeating, I thought. And I said I wouldn't touch it if I were he. And then he said, had I seen a very good article by Roger Stevens in the Spectator. So I bought it and saw this review, which I've got here. I can show it to you. And it was, Roger Stevens was reviewing 2 or 3 books about Iran. And he said some very nice things about the Shah's regime. He mentioned Savak, but not in any great condemnation of its methods and so on. But anybody reading it with a balanced mind would have seen this as a favourable article about Iran by an eminent person like Roger Stevens. So I said to the Shah, why did you authorize this attack on Roger Stevens? I said, he's one of your best friends in England. He's recognized as such. He loves Iran as much as I do. And he's only got Iran's interest. And the Shah drew himself up on his feet and said, he has no right to refer to my reforms as moderate. They are radical. And that was the extent of what... and I went into the history of this, and I'm pretty certain that probably it was a Savak man in the embassy had telegraphed about this article out to Tehran. One person mentioned to me as Parvez Adil, who was in the charge of the press in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and was not a very nice person. Nice towards the British, at any rate. He got an English mother, I think that may account for it. He had gone to the Shah and said, you see this man Stevens referring to your reforms as moderate. And so the Shah said, right, attack Stevens. And so that's how it was done. And I just cite that as an extraordinary example, but a typical example of the Shah's vindictiveness and pettiness and how he would listen to a relatively minor sort of official. I didn't tell him that his ambassador in London, Raji, had told me he thought it was an excellent article, because that would have been the end of Raji. Anyway, I mention that as a sideline on the Shah's character. But having said all that, I went from the Shah to see...
what else did you say with the Shah?
I can't remember. I'll dig out in a few minutes if you like. Let's switch off. I'll pull out my diary and see if I...
before we go to your meeting with... continue with your meeting with the Shah, could you give a reference to this article by Mr. Roger Stevens?
Yes, it appeared in The Spectator, 26th of February, 1977. Okay. I've forgotten and haven't got a copy of the K. Han article attacking him, but it was quite soon afterwards. Well, I think the best thing about the Shah, because memories are bad, and although I never kept a very full diary, it might be worthwhile just reading my entry, although it's a rough and ready one. Because I don't normally keep a diary. I gave up keeping a daily diary when I retired from being ambassador in Tehran, but when I went on trips I tend to keep one. This is dated Tehran, Tuesday, 19th of April, 1977. 9 a.m. Set off with Majid, he's in the embassy car, he was a chauffeur, for my 10:15 a.m. audience with HIM at the Niavaran Palace. I was ushered in bang on at 10:15. The Shah greeted me with a beaming smile and, you haven't changed a bit, quote. I said the same of him. He then thanked me for helping Iranian causes in England. I told him of St. Anthony's seminar on Iran last term. He bristled slightly when I said that Persian students were afraid of answering questions, etc., because of fear of spies. I also had a bit of an argument with him over K. Han's recent article containing Roger Stevens' review for The Spectator. The Shah insisted he was entitled to radical, but did admit that Roger was a good friend of Iran's. We talked international politics a bit. HIM very worried about the state of Turkey, in brackets especially, Pakistan and India. Also hates the idea of a Palestinian state, which would, he said, be the end of Jordan. He also spoke of recent CIA report of Russian oil shortage in a few years' time. This would increase Russian interest in Middle East oil and Indian Ocean. I presented him with a copy of my book, full stop. He said he had heard it was very good, and when I said I hoped he wouldn't let it be pirated, indicated that though Persia has not yet signed any copyright agreement, steps would be taken to see that my book wasn't pirated. I might add in parenthesis, he was as good to his word, and it wasn't pirated until Khomeini came into power. And the diary continues, I reminded him of an earlier conversation when I had told him that it was a waste of money to commission books about Iran. On Asadullah, that is Asadullah Alam, he said he thought he would not be able to work full-time again. He might begin writing his memoirs, as he had many confidences of the Shah which others had not. Audience lasted half an hour. I said no, half an hour, and was a very friendly one. On my way downtown, I looked in at the Kayhan bookshop to be told they still had no further copies of the book, and that since I left them at 11 a.m. the previous morning, over 300 people had been round wanting to buy the book, get my autograph. Back at the embassy, I reported on my audience to Robert Alston and George Chalmers. Tony Parsons been away in the south. That's it. I mean, the rest is just personal stuff.
Mm-hmm. Did you also see Mr. Alam on this trip?
No, I think he was away. Oh, yes, I must have had dinner with him, I think. I saw him. I didn't have any talk.
But I know that you did see Dr. Evans.
Just let me see. I don't think. You asked me another question.
Well, I said that did you see either Mr. Alam or Dr. Evans?
Yes, well, I don't think Alam was there. Haven't got any record of seeing him. But I did go and call on Dr. Iqbal, who was the head of the National Iranian Oil Company, who was no friend of mine and had once or twice been down to my house here in Haddenham, and I knew he would be upset if I didn't see him, but I was very rushed for time because of this book being launched, and I was giving a lecture at the British Institute. But I did see him on Saturday the 16th of April, and this is the entry in my diary for that day. We worked on my lecture in the Embassy Library in the morning, apart from 3/4-hour call on Iqbal at his NIOC office. He was remarkably and surprisingly critical about the state of things here. Corruption worse than ever, discontent widespread, difficulties with labour, the Shah surrounded by flatterers and unwilling to listen to people. Extraordinary to have Iqbal, the most loyal of Persians, talking thus. Apparently he hasn't opened his heart to Tony Parsons like this. And that was it. And I went back and told Tony Parsons, and he said, well, he'd heard this indirectly, but not directly. In his book, Tony Parsons implies that, although he mentions this interview of mine, he implies that he had heard this from Iqbal too, but in fact he hadn't, not direct, he told me at the time.
Do you remember a little more about what Dr. Evans said, aside from the brief?
No, I can't remember anything, except he was a bit vitriolic about the Shah and the royal family, and their corruption and the discontent, and how the Shah would listen to nobody at all. And coming from Iqbal, who has always been the most loyal and sycophantic of ministers, really, it was very surprising. Although I might say that before that, after Iqbal had been Prime Minister, I think he was exiled to Paris for a bit, wasn't he?
Yeah.
And then he went, like, as I mentioned yesterday, General Batmangalich, not Batmangalich, General Bakhtiar wanting to see me before I went to Tehran. So Iqbal wanted to see me. And I didn't mind seeing Iqbal because he was an old friend and he was living in Paris, and I saw him in Paris. My wife and I were there. And we had dinner with him, and he then was extremely critical about the Shah and everything. And
what aspects of the Shah?
I can't remember. I can't remember. But when he went back and got back into favour, not a word. And of course, he was always nudging to get into the picture with the Shah. It was most extraordinary sort of conceit of the man. Although basically he was a modest person, and I liked him, and I believe was honest, unlike some of his brothers.
What was the reaction of your embassy when you described what? Well,
I don't know, because when you go back as a visitor, nobody takes much notice of you, and I reported this, and I was off seeing my friends, and so I don't know. But I think in the light of history, they didn't pay enough attention to what was quite a danger signal then, because as anybody who reads Tony Parsons' book will see, that right up into the end he seemed to be quite confident all would be well. And this was, what, a year and nearly 2 years before the Shah fell. So there was a big danger signal then, and it was ignored.
Obviously you didn't see it fit to make any hints about it when you saw the Shah yourself 3 days later. No,
it would have been totally out of place, I think. And I didn't make any effort to report it to the Foreign Office. I mean, when an ambassador retires, he tends to keep his nose out of things. At any rate, I reported it to the embassy in Tehran, and that was as far as I could go, because they have to weigh up that against all that other information, which may or may not support it.
Did you see any other important Iranians?
No, not as far as I can remember. I was, when one's been in a country as long as I had, you have a vast number of friends there, and I was chiefly concerned with seeing one's friends and being entertained, and was completely exhausted by the sort of entertainment we got. But I don't think I saw anybody else of any political consequence. And Hoveyda gave a lunch for me, and I might just look up that, because that's, I mentioned yesterday, was rather a disappointing lunch in the sense that Hoveyda struck me as being arrogant and power had gone to his head, and he wasn't the sort of modest, friendly Hoveyda that I'd known when I was there. Let me switch off for a minute now. Just look. There was an odd mullah. The British have always been accused of having links with the mullahs and so on.
I wanted to ask you about that.
And as I say in the introduction to my new book that's coming out, is the best of my knowledge, the link between the British and the mullahs took place over a limited period at the early days of this present 20th century, when Sir Arthur Harding was in charge of the embassy, and he had contact with some of the ulema, and he saw the ulema as being very anti-Russian and also anti-Shah at that time. He feared that the ulema might do something really rash and so provoke the Shah to call in Russian assistance. He therefore thought it would be a good thing to try and influence the mullahs, both in favour of British interests and moderation, but also to avoid them doing anything which would lead to Russian invasion of Iran, which would force the British to also move into Sistan. And he got permission from the Foreign Secretary, Lord Lansdowne, to deal with the clergy, hand out monetary funds, both to them in Tehran and in Najaf and Karbala. In the end, I think by about 1905 or thereabouts, the leading ulama he was in touch with died. I've forgotten his name, but it's all in the Public Record Office. And as far as I can discover, and I made a number of inquiries, that contact with the clergy came to an end then. It certainly would have come to the end after the 1907 Anglo-Russian conversion. Now, since then, to the best of my knowledge, and I've looked through countless embassy papers when I've had the time of going back over the period, there was no real link with the mullahs at all. After I left Tehran, John Russell, the counsellor at the embassy, whom I mentioned yesterday, did have a contact with the Imam Jummeh of the day. But you probably know the Imam Jummeh of that time, this is 59, 60, was more a businessman than a mullah. And John Russell was always rather, hypnotized by names, and just because it was Imam Jummeh, he used to see him occasionally. But he was not what I call a regular informant of the embassy, and there was no special link. It was just that period of the Imam Jummeh was brought to see me in London when I was an undersecretary. Again, he was after business, not after any religious things or any. So that was a link with the mullahs, but a very tenuous one.
This is Dr. Hassan Imami that you must be referring to.
Was it his name? Yes, that's the one. Yes, that's the one. But that was the one. but there was no question of him being a sort of agent of the British. And then, in my day, there was a very curious chap who I always regarded as not normal, called Shustari, who had a beard and talked very broken English, and he greeted me, I think, in the street one day. So, "Are you the British ambassador? I must come and talk to you." And then I met him at Prince Ghulam Reza at the time of the Nowruz, you know, who was at home in his palace and receiving people, and I went there, and he was there. And this chap used to come round to the embassy about every 3 or 4 months sometimes, I think, for when I ran my last few years, and talk nonsense. I mean, he talked about intelligence service and all this sort of thing, but, you know, he was really mad. And when I was in Tehran the last time, he saw me in a taxi. Or he was in a taxi and I was in the street, and this led to him coming round the embassy. And as I put my entry as the mad mullah Shustari called in the afternoon, and that was all. Mm-hmm. But I would have thought that was the sum total of British links with the mullahs.
Does your statement include whatever contacts the intelligence services may have had?
Yes, I never heard of them having any links with the clergy. I think, you see, after the Muharram riots, at any rate, of 1963, for all practical purposes, the mullahs, we may have been wrong, but seemed to be a spent force. I mean, and there was no evidence in my last few years that the clergy were getting back into any sort of position of power at all. I mean, I think that all developed after the 73, 74 increase in oil prices, the movement of people in from the countryside to the towns, the lack of accommodation, the inflation, all these things which caused so much discontent, gave the mullahs a captive audience in the mosque, about the only place that people had to go to get any comfort anywhere. Mm-hmm. But that's my theory, I wasn't there.
Did you have any other, between 1977 and I suppose 79 or 80, that you met the Shah in Nassau? In between, did you see any of the former or current at the time high officials of Iran's government, Mr. Alam or Homeida or anybody in?
Yes, I saw
in London or in Tehran or anywhere.
I saw Mr. Alam, in fact, came down here with his wife to stay with us in 1973, I think it was. He was over here, and he spent one night, and we took him out to dinner at a pub near Aylesbury, and when we got back, the telephone was ringing furiously. It was Afshar, the ambassador, to say that he'd got news that Alam's mother was very ill, and he must return immediately to Tehran. And so, in fact, I think she died. And so, instead of Alam spending a weekend with us, he went back that early next morning, caught the plane. But I saw him whenever he came to London, but he never came down here again, and I was sometimes rather puzzled. He seemed to be rather elusive. Whether he had a girl in the background or not, I don't know, but his wife was with him, but he was there. I did, when he got very ill, I was nearly dying in Paris. I did telephone to the hospital, the American hospital in Paris, and talked to him on the phone, and I said, "Look, I'll come over and see you," because I was, I say, very fond of him, and I didn't want to. And he said, "No, I'm getting better, and I'm going down to the south of France to recover. And why don't you come down there?" Well, my wife and Iona, were planning to go to France, and in fact, I think we'd already bought our tickets to go sometime a month or so ahead, and so I said, "All right, we'll fly down to see you." So I flew down with my wife to the south of France. I've got a note where I've forgotten where it was now, but somewhere outside Nice, and stayed with Alam as his guest for 2 days. And he was a sick man. He had detectives where we did 1 or 2 walks together, but he couldn't walk very far. But we didn't talk politics at all. He did, I remember though, telling me he had to get permission from the Shah even to have me as his guest in the south of France. No. He didn't dare move without getting the Shah's permission. At one stage, it may not have been there, when I went back to Tehran, I'd given a talk at St. Anthony's about just after I retired. Must have been in some time in the spring of 1972, perhaps, it may have been in 71, but to quite a crowded audience at the Middle East Centre on British interest in Iran. And I had fallen out with Afshar, the ambassador, both over that incident I mentioned in Switzerland, but also some very injudicious remarks he made in a speech to the Iran Society. So Afshar didn't like me at all. Well, he'd sent somebody down from the embassy to listen. And I gave a talk about Iran, which I think, from the point of view of the more liberal members of St. Anthony's, was regarded as far too favourable towards Iran and the Shah and all his good works. But a report went from Afshar, which Alam told me about later, to the Shah, saying that I had given a very hostile report. I've forgotten, I don't know what he said, I never saw the thing, but Alam said the Shah showed him this telegram, said, see, that's what your English friend does. So that was that. Well, a few, maybe a year or so later, I went to America and I was invited by the National Defence College of Canada to go and talk at Kingston, Ontario, and there I went down to Chicago, where I had been consul some years before. And I gave a talk there to I think it was the Council on Foreign Relations, and I talked along very similar lines to the talk I gave to St. Anthony's. There the Iranian Consul General, I think his name was Hatam, wanted, I suppose, to win favour with the Shah, but he sent a panegyric about this excellent speech I had given. So for next time I saw Alam, he said he'd had his report also, you see. So I said, well, this is Afshar's interpretation as opposed to another man, but I just mentioned that as the total unreliability of certain Iranian diplomats.
I'm interested in sort of the trend that you may have noticed in Mr. Alam's view of the situation in Iran and his relationship with the Shah. Did you get any sense of that at any point in the latter years of his life?
Well, I think that he became increasingly disillusioned. When I first went there in 1963 as ambassador, he was close to the Shah, was able to, I think, influence him to some extent. But I can't remember what year, but towards the end, maybe 1965, 66 or thereabout, he would tell me that the Shah wouldn't listen to him at all. He was increasingly disillusioned. And also, because the Shah knew he was a friend of mine, he seemed to enjoy spoiling his Fridays riding with me, because Alam undoubtedly enjoyed this. I mean, we very rarely talked business. It was usually he was reminiscing about the past, or he might have had his girlfriend down there riding or something like that. But it was a very happy occasion, and we both greatly enjoyed riding at Farabad. But as the years went by, the Shah seemed deliberately to try and stop him riding with me. I mean, he would come up, we'd go down there, and then there'd be a message from the palace, the Shah wanted to see Alam and that sort of thing. And I gathered both from Alam and from his wife that this was almost deliberate by the Shah. I don't think he resented him having a friendship. Well, he may have even resented that, but he didn't want him to enjoy himself. So I think Alam, who was very loyal, he never said anything to me against the Shah personally. But I think he became increasingly disillusioned by him and by the fact that he wouldn't listen to him. And in the end, as Alam told me, that he thought the Shah Banu's position was in jeopardy, because she used to stand up to him and try and influence him on certain things. For instance, when there was trouble about one of the nightclubs up near Shimran, the Shah had talked about people with long hair and so on. You may remember the police raided one of these nightclubs and took off these various artists who were there and cut their hair. And this news, of course, got to the Empress, who by lunchtime, when she saw the Shah, told her about it and complained, and by the end of the day, the chief of police had been dismissed. I've forgotten the year, but that was a sort of influence she did have at one time. But I think that all vanished towards the end of my period, and the Shah wouldn't listen to anybody. And I know one of my diaries about 1970 or 69, I have a sort of odd thing, the Shah's getting too big for his boots, you know, and this was a sort of feeling that was developing even...
As early as that?
Before, yeah. And certainly when I had to make my recommendation about whether the Queen... recommendation whether the Queen should attend the celebrations at Persepolis in October 71. I knew I wouldn't be there, but my feeling was that it was, why should we send the Queen? The Shah had become so arrogant. He was taking a very hostile line over some of our problems over the Gulf Islands and that sort of thing, and so I had no compunction at all in recommending the Queen shouldn't go. And I think that was indicative of my own personal feelings about the Shah, because one book I recently came out on 1980 by J.B. Kelly called Arabia, you probably know the book. He talks about my passionate admiration for the Shah. Well, that's totally untrue. On the other hand, I thought he was providing the best leadership that the country was likely to get, and for that reason it should be supported. But any passionate admiration for him I never had.
But in your last meeting with Mr. Alam, you don't remember anything significant which is worth noting?
None at all, no. Each time I went back, I think that last time he must have been away, he was ill, but the previous time I'd been back, I saw him, he gave a dinner for me and saw him, but there was no discussion of substance at all as far as I would have recorded it, I think, if it had been anything worthwhile. I also, just after I retired, I did go, and my wife and I both went and stayed with him in Arosa. He was skiing there with his wife, and I was conducting, or going to be a chairman of an American seminar in Rome, you know, that, what's it called, that Institute of East Mediterranean Studies, and I have been asked to be chairman of a seminar on titled Changing Balance of Power in the Persian Gulf. And as a preliminary, I went down to Rome to discuss this with the Americans. And on my way back, I went and spent 2 days with Alam at Arosa with his family there. He was summoned away to see the Shah at St. Moritz when I was there, so there was no peace for the man. He also there was a rather unpleasant character there talking about Kishma, a man whose name has come out in various trials since as a very corrupt member, and I think this was what I was saying.
Was this Kish or Kish?
Was it Kishma, wasn't it? What was the island?
Well, there was one that they set up as a resort, and
that's the one, yeah.
And brought people from France and
yeah, that's it. Kish was. Yes. And Alam was much involved in that, and I'm always told, because you know his two daughters live in great style in London, and that a lot of their money comes from being involved in that. I mean, it was I never got to the bottom of it, but it was a nasty bit of business, and I've forgotten. If you want it, I can give you the name of the man who was there at Arosa with plans of all these things, and begins with an M. Was it? I forgot. I've got his card, but he was. There was a nasty smell about the man altogether. Again, I said.
Monsef?
That's it, Monsef, yes. Yeah, that's the man. And he was there at Arosa seeing Alam with plans, and his daughters seemed to be all half involved. You know, it was a curious setup.
Any other important people, Iranians, that you saw before seeing the Shah in Nassau?
No, well, I saw a lot over the years, because they used to come over, and even though I was retired, there were Iranians such as Mehdi Piraste, who was retired who was in Brussels, now he's in Canada, but he seemed to think that I could still make him Prime Minister, and he came over to see me, and that was all he wanted, and, you know, one had Other people like that used to turn up. I can't remember them. But the belief of these, you might say, senior Iranians in believing that the former British ambassador could make them prime ministers and so on is quite extraordinary. And Pioneer was one example of the, not Pioneer, Piraste. Hussein Pioneer came down to, Baga Pioneer came down to see me too. And I think he wanted something like that too. But he's fallen out with Hoveyda. I never got the bottom of that. But there was we've had it here in Duck Bottom, a stream of Iranians come, and some of them, as I say, wanted help like that, and would never believe it when we told them one had no power at all.
During the last few months or weeks of the Pahlavi dynasty, was your advice or counsel sought by your own government or by Iranians as to what's going on and what should be done?
Not at all, no. Yeah, no. I don't think on any occasion. And I think the pity was that in Tehran that there was nobody at the time who had any, you might say, accumulated knowledge of the Iranian situation. I mean, I'm told that there were people who didn't know who Intizam was, really. I mean, they could find out because we had lists of personalities, but there were nobody who had contact with these people at all. Not that it would have made any difference, I think, but I wasn't asked at all by anybody.
Mm-hmm. And then, what made you go see the Shah in Nassau?
Well, that was the problem then was, as you know, the Shah was wanting to find somewhere to live in exile.
Yes.
And the Americans had agreed to have him, but when he stopped off in Egypt, the Americans had second thoughts and said no. And I'm not absolutely certain of the truth of this, but I believe that from Morocco, the Shah sent an Englishman who was one of these PR men hanging around the Shah. I've got his name somewhere. I may be able to tell you later. I've forgotten it now. To find out from Mrs. Thatcher that if she won the elections, would she let him settle in England?
He does have an estate here from what...
He had an estate at Godalming in Surrey, which he'd never seen, as far as I know. And the story is, I can't vouch for this, that Mrs. Thatcher said, yes, if she won the election, she seen no reason why he shouldn't come. Well, she won the election, and the thing was that the Shah come. But Fisher and Lord Carrington, who was foreign minister, was also, who knew the Shah well, and was a man of compassion, also felt that the Shah should be allowed. But the officials in the Foreign Office, and headed by Anthony Parsons, who was then the Undersecretary dealing with the Middle East, advised very strongly against it. I mean, they had three reasons. One was a security reason. They said there are a great many Iranian students, thousands of them, all gunning for the Shah, and you will have a very serious security problem. Mrs. Thatcher was prepared to face up to that one. Then there was a question, the commercial argument, that if you do this, you'll either find you can't get oil from Iran, or you will have your exports stopped, both of which were important to the British economy at the time, particularly oil at that time. But no, she was prepared to face that one. And the third argument was, well, all right, but the fanatic Ayatollahs will probably kidnap the British ambassador, all members of his staff, and hold them against the Shah. And are you then prepared to either see the British ambassador shot or surrender and hand over the Shah? And that was what made Mrs. Thatcher flinch, as it were, and say no, she wasn't prepared to face that. And she was told this is a genuine risk, and of course it's quite true. Look what happened to the Americans later. So the then was, would somebody go out and tell the Shah, because they didn't want to just send a message. So I was summoned to the Foreign Office and asked whether I would go out. And I said I would on two conditions. I said, first of all, I was on the board of Shell, and I didn't want it to come out that I was out there hobnobbing with the Shah, because this might do damage to Shell, who were very reliant on Iranian oil at that moment. And secondly, I said I was booked to go fishing the following week down in the on Exmoor, in a little pub, and I said, if I'm not going to give up that because I won't be able to rebook, it's such a popular pub, so I must either go immediately or after I've had my 4 days fishing. So the answer was, all right, you go immediately. And so I was given a false passport, and I was taken to the airport by my wife, and I was told the only disguise I need wear, apart from the passport, was dark glasses, and off I went, and to Nassau. Well, we didn't want our High Commissioner, a man called Duncan, who was an old friend of mine, to intervene with the local authorities, because they were having trouble with their own people about the Shah, you know, and we did not want to be in any obligation to them on the Shah. They might say, all right, now you take him off our hands. So our High Commissioner was told to fix an appointment with the Shah but direct, without doing well. The telephones were all cut that day. There had been demonstrations against the Shah the day I was going out there.
Where?
In Nassau.
Really?
Oh, yeah. And the telephones had all been cut off from his little island he was on, Paradise Island. And our High Commissioner went over to the club. You see, he was in a compound of a club on what was called Paradise Island. And he sat around the bar all day long, hoping to find someone who looked like an Iranian, whom he could ask tell him about my coming. But he gave up. He couldn't find anybody. So when I arrived in the evening, he sent a very junior member of his staff to meet me, not to attract any attention, and I went to stay with him. And he said, look, I'm in an absolute quandary. I don't know how we're going to get at the Shah, because I failed. Telephones are all cut. But by next morning, the telephones were restored. And I had learnt from Mrs. Alam, whom I had gone to have tea with, I think, the afternoon before I went off. I didn't tell her I was going off, but I just asked her out of curiosity, who's with the Shah? And she told me that Kambiz Atabay was with the Shah. So next morning, and Kambiz Atabay had come through London a few months before and left a message. He'd telephoned me, and I wasn't here, but he'd come through. So I had a reason to. He was an old friend of mine. He was in charge of the horses at Farabad, where I used to ride. So I got through on the telephone to this club, and with a great deal of difficulty eventually got hold of Kambiz Atabay. And I said who I was. I said I was here, and I told a lie in the sense I said, I'm on my way to New York. I'm just here for a day or two and would like to see you. So I got in a taxi and went across quite close to the High Commissioner house, crossed the bridge to this club and saw Kambiz, and we had a drink, and I told him I was there under a false name. Harold, what was it? Edward Wilson, my name was. So he kept on calling me Edward in loud voice, and I told him why I'd come and was anxious to see the Shah personally and explain. So he said, well, I'll phone you back. So I went back to the High Commissioner's house, and a few hours later, he telephoned and said, come over this afternoon. And I went across in the afternoon, dressed like a tourist. Normally when I saw the Shah, I wore a morning coat, but this time I went without a tie and not to attract any attention, and got into the club quite easily. Then the Shah was behind you might say, barricade of barbed wire with all sorts of American security men, and although Kambiz Atabay explained that I was expected by the Shah, they frisked me and all the rest of it, and I went in to see him in this little house, and the date of that was the 20th of May, I saw the Shah.
What year?
1979. If you like, I can read out my diary. It's quite a bit, but it's historically interesting. This is my entry in the diary, Monday, 21st of May, 10:30 a.m., Nassau. Yesterday's events worked like clockwork, so that by supper time we were able to telegraph the FO, mission accomplished, etc. I managed to get through to Camby's at the Ocean Club by telephone and arranged to meet him there at 11 a.m. I went there by taxi, a 10-minute journey across the bridge to the Paradise Island, wearing, as advised, dark glasses. We sat by the swimming pool, surrounded by half-naked beauties and children, but out of earshot of others. I told Camby's that I was undercover as Edward Wilson, and from that moment on he called me Edward. I told him why I wished to see HIM, and that it was important there should be no publicity. We then went on to discuss events in Iran and the sadness of it all. Camby said the Shah had been far too indecisive in Tehran during the critical days when firm decisions could easily have saved the situation. Camby's wife and children are in London, and he seems to be the only person of any seniority now with the Shah. I asked him about Amir Sadeghi, telling him about recent telephone conversations with him at home. He told me that Amir Sadeghi enjoyed support and confidence of the Empress, but not of the Shah, and that he, Camby's, regarded him with some suspicion. He had not been able to explain how he had managed to get away from Tehran. He confirmed that Amir Sadeghi had visited the Empress here in Nassau. You can talk about that later, perhaps. I returned to the Duncan house after over an hour with Camby's, who phoned shortly after lunch to say that his principal, meaning the Shah, would see me at 6 p.m. Had a sleep in the afternoon, then by taxi to the Ocean Club wearing a dark glasses and open-neck shirt. Camby's was waiting me, and we walked 100 yards or so to the wired compound within which the Shah and family are housed. American security men everywhere, all carrying walkie-talkies. Despite Camby's assurances, I was held up a few minutes at the entrance gate before being allowed to enter the compound, where I was frisked. I ran into the Crown Prince and had a few words with him before being whisked into the small house where the Shah greeted me. We sat alone on two small sofas facing each other with a coffee table in between us. I was given a cup of tea and the Shah drank plain mineral water. I had just over an hour with the Shah. I began and ended with the question of his asylum in the United Kingdom and why HMG could not, for the moment, so long as the Persian government exercised no control over the country, end quote, offer asylum to the Shah or his family. I said I hoped the Shah would understand and accept this. He replied, quote, I accept, but do not understand why you pay any attention to a government which does not matter, end quote. We then had a rambling conversation along lines of some of my previous talks with him, though this was inevitably a gloomier one. He was inclined to blame his Western friends for giving him the wrong advice, to liberalize and introduce democratic ways, to quit the country. The loss of Iran was a serious blow for the West. He feared Iran would eventually go communist, and feared too that this might happen in Egypt. The Middle East oil would be at risk, and that would be the end of the West. Russia was set on world domination. If not, why was she building up such a powerful navy? He did not believe, as some people seem to, that Russia could ever become a democratic country. Harking back, the Shah said he thought our biggest mistake was to have removed his father from the throne in 1941. He was never pro-Hitler. He spoke of the power of the mullahs. I reminded him of the farewell dinner he had given for Iona and me at Sadabad in September 1955, when I had urged him on instructions from the Foreign Office to follow the example of his father and crack down on the mullahs, who had been the inspiration of the anti-Baha'i riots earlier in the year. I reminded him that he had then told me that he was too weak to do so. We then spoke of the 1963 Muharram riots, when the Shah had effectively stamped on the mullahs. I broke in to ask him how many people had been killed on that occasion. He said 110, full stop. I told him that Alam had given me a figure of 94 or so, which I had believed to be true instead of the 1,000 alleged by some. The Shah repeated the correct figure was 110. I was glad to hear this, as I have always believed, and this seems to confirm it, that Alam's figure was far nearer the truth than what was claimed by the Shah's critics. When the Shah indicated the time had come for me to go, I reverted to my brief on the asylum question and said that the Foreign Secretary wanted to be able to say in Parliament or elsewhere that the position had been explained to the Shah, who had both understood and accepted it. The Shah said that he thought we need say no more than that he had not asked for asylum. I argued that this was not enough, and we must be able to say more. The Shah then agreed that we might say he understood and accepted, provided we also made it clear that he had not asked us for asylum. I said I felt sure Lord Carrington would agree to this. Early in our conversation, after I had told HIM of our position, he said that there were possibilities of his settling in Austria, Switzerland, or, quote, one other country, in brackets, which according to Camby's is Mexico. In my morning talk with Camby's, I said in answer to his question that I thought South Africa would be a suitable country. There were no Persian students there. The South Africans were grateful to the Shah for supplies of Iranian oil. Their security service was a good one, etc. But Camby's clearly did not like the idea, and there was no mention of it when I saw the Shah. That was it. Though there had been quite a big campaign in London before I went out to allow the Shah to come here, particularly in the right-wing British press, the Telegraph and the Daily Express, and by certain members of Parliament. And once I'd been out to see him, although there was no publicity, nothing more was heard about it. And I can only assume, because I haven't talked to Mrs. Thatcher about it since, that they must have told people like Julian Amory and so on, who were championing the Shah coming here, that the Shah had been seen and the position explained to him, because as you probably know, nothing more appeared in the British press about having the Shah here in exile. So that's the story of the... I came back and got my fishing.
Julian Emery is what is his?
He's a right-wing conservative member of Parliament for Brighton, and has always been a champion of lost causes, really. And when the Crown Prince Reza was over here in December, I mean, Amory was the chap who was arranging for him to meet people and so on. They wanted me to have dinner with him. I wouldn't go. I mean, I just don't wish to be caught up in any of these manoeuvres now.
Now I have a series of questions dealing with the things we've talked about up to this point. Some are general and some are more specific. The first one's of a general nature. That is to do with, as ambassador in Iran, what were your major goals and concerns? I mean, if you were to name 3 or 4 goals and concerns that you had as ambassador, things that you really had to look out for, what were those?
Well, the main one, of course, was to have the most friendly possible relations with the country, which meant with the Shah, in order to promote British strategic interests, such as overflying rights and things like that, ensure the supply of oil, and to promote British exports.
What does overfly rights mean? That means for military and...
for military, at a time when there was a confrontation in Indonesia in the early 1960s over, not Brunei, but that area, there was a confrontation. Well, we were able to overfly Iran with our military aircraft to see supplies. I mean, it's a very important thing, this overflying, all right. It was when we had an empire east of Suez, and that was of great value. And of course, we wanted to keep the Shah in the Western camp. I mean, it was, I say, one's main objective was to have the best possible relations with Iran, and therefore satisfy him on his demands when he wanted equipment and so on. When we could, we, military equipment or naval equipment and so on. But I think the overriding interest of any ambassador who has his interest of his country at heart is to promote the most friendly possible relations, because from that develop all the other things.
I have a question about the export and commercial end of what you discussed, and I'm just wondering what would be sort of the range of intervention or role that the ambassador would have to pursue in these matters. For instance, I've just noted down some of the larger sort of deals that were concluded during your term as ambassador. One was a Leyland bus factory, or Ruston and Hornsby generators, standard telegraph and cable control equipment, and then of course one of the larger non-military projects was the Iran national agreement with Roots, which a lot of Iranians believed was partly owned by the royal family, which was never proved one way or the other.
Yeah. Well, I very rarely intervened on commercial matters. I considered my function, if a businessman came out and wanted help, if he wanted to see the Shah, he would normally arrange that through his own agents. But if there was any particular reason why I should intervene and get an audience, I would do so. And, for instance, when Dunlop at one stage were interested, and I think I did ask because there was serious trouble. The chairman of Dunlop came out, Sir, what's his name, Geddes, I've forgotten his first name, but he came out to sign up for negotiation for Dunlop factory. And Hussain Ansari had just taken over as Minister of Commerce or Economy, and he suddenly, at the last minute, said that that must have a guarantee from Dunlop that after 2 years of production they would export a third of their production. And Sir Ray Geddes, R-E-A-Y, Geddes, said, I can't get this, I just can't, certain. And this was a major sort of hold-up on a negotiation which had gone on for about 3 years. And in that case, I went to Alam, I think, I can't remember the full, and said, look, I think it's absolutely essential that Geddes sees the Shah and explains his position, and that would be the sort of thing. But normally, I did not intervene on behalf. And I mentioned yesterday how Ali Mansour summoned me to tell me he'd placed an order for Leyland buses. Well, I'd never intervened on that. It was all done through the agents and so on. On the promotion of exports, which became much more acute in the time of my successors, and I think they got much more involved in pushing. There was such competition among different. But in my day, I was concerned with keeping, you could say, relations friendly, because if the Shah took, again, the British for some particular reason or other, he was quite capable of saying, like, no orders to the British. He did the same thing with the French when Pompidou didn't go for the celebrations in Persepolis in 1971. I believe he cancelled all big orders given to the French, and for a number of years the French were in the doghouse. I can't think of any particular things in which I intervened with the Shah. I did go and see him about attempt by Mehdi Sami, when he was governor of the central bank, to alter the terms under which the two British banks were operating in Iran. I said that I thought this was contrary to what had been undertaken under solemn agreements and so on. But
yes.
On Centurion tanks, which was a big order, the initiative came from the Iranian side. As best I remember, we had arms salesmen coming out, but I didn't get involved in promoting the sales. It was the Shah dealing with, I think his name was Sutcliffe at that time, who came out from the Ministry of Defense and so on.
So you didn't even you didn't find yourself in a position of either promoting or exerting personal effort on behalf of a deal or a project, or trying to perhaps discourage the deal. For instance, some American ambassadors have claimed that they were against over purchases of military equipment, and therefore they saw it as their duty to try to sort of slow the Shah down in certain purchases.
Yeah, I think that's true of the Americans. They were not keen. It was the salesman. At one stage there was a complaint by our arms salesman. I saw a report which he sent to our military attaché, where he said that I was not giving them the support they wish on. And when I got to London, I had it out with him, and I said, this is absolute nonsense, but I don't think it's for me to push all the time and to buy British, whatever it was, rapier, weapons, ground air missiles or something. I was quite prepared to weigh in and get alarm or who it was to see the representative, but I didn't want to get myself too involved, and I in fact was unhappy about the extent that we were pushing arms, but I didn't take any steps to discourage it. Mm-hmm. But you asked about Iran National and Roots. Now that is quite an interesting case, because what happened there was two brothers, I think their name was Hatami, wasn't it? Hayami, was it? Hayami. One or two of them came to see me with a letter of introduction, I think, from Ardashir Zahidi, who was close to them. And they told me that they had a license to assemble a passenger car. Mm-hmm. They were already doing something Mercedes-Benz, I think. They wished to have a British car. If they couldn't get a British car, they would turn to Germany or France, I've forgotten what. Well, I was quite impressed with what they said, and with my commercial counsellor, who I think then was Peter Wilkinson, who since died, I went down to look at this Iran National Works. Well, I'm no expert on factories, but nevertheless, it was an impressive thing. So I went back to the embassy and wrote a dispatch to the Foreign Office saying that we'd had this request and that I thought this should be taken seriously and we should try and get Roots or whoever. I don't know whether I mentioned Roots, but I said they should try. And of course Wilkinson wrote to the Board of Trade, as it then was, and made the same point. He said this was a very serious request and we should do something about it. So the government, the Foreign Office and the Board of Trade got in touch with the motor manufacturers, and Roots came out. And that's how it started. I mean, in my office, whether the royal family had interest, didn't interest me. I mean, my interest was to see that the British manufacturer got it. And they did. And you see, the same sort of thing happened with Dunlop. One of the Farman-Farmians, Ali, who since died, he was killed in a skiing accident. Ali Farman-Farmian came to see me one day in the office and said he had got a license to set up a tire factory, and he wanted to get Dunlop in if possible, and if not he would get the Americans, but could I do? So I knew someone at Dunlop, not Ray Geddes, I didn't know the chairman, but I knew a man called Simon there, who since left them, but I wrote to him and said, and also we wrote to the Board of Trade, and I said, look, this is a serious thing. Ali Farman is a highly intelligent operator, and this is worth going. And so Dunlop took this up and got to a point when, as I mentioned, it was sabotaged by Ansari in the end. And an interesting gloss on that, because finally when Ray Geddes went back to London after having come out to sign and then refusing to sign, and because he wouldn't accept this condition of Ansari, he wrote me a manuscript letter saying that he was not going to sign unless they gave up this point, and that he feared American interests had got at Hushang Ansari or something. Well, I sent this letter up to Alam just to show him that they were really pulling out. I said the Shah has said it would all be all clear, and so Alam went to the Shah and said this has still been held up. And the Shah said, well, tell Ansari not to be so silly and tell him to get on with it. And so Alam then sent this letter of Sir Ray Geddes to me, his manuscript letter, to Ansari and said, go and clear up this business, Dunlop would have the business. Well, Ansari, being a very slippery and able chap, he picked up this insinuation that he was in the pockets of the Americans and made a big issue of this and said he would resign unless the British ambassador apologized. Alam telephoned me and said, come and ask me to go and see him. He says, look, he said, I made a very bad mistake. He said, I didn't really read this letter properly. I sent it to Hushang Ansari, and this is a position. He's demands, and I said, well, I can't apologize to him. I'm not going to apologize to him. I don't mind just saying, I'm sorry, there's been a misunderstanding or something, but well, the upshot was that I saw Ansari a week or two later. I didn't ask to see him, especially at the American Embassy dinner, and I just half apologized in the sense of saying sorry. But that was enough for Ansari to get his way, and it went to Goodrich, you see, not to Dunlop. I mention that as a sort of deviation and the extent to which I would intervene. I mean, in something like that, where there had been some really crooked business, I would intervene, but it was, normally I didn't.
But as far as the Iran national deal is concerned, it wasn't told to you, or you didn't sense that there was some very powerful figures behind this deal, and that these two brothers...
No. We took it straight on its merits, and I didn't certainly make any issue of them. I didn't even know that Zahedi was involved at that time. I mean, he sent these people an introduction, but I didn't know that there was any of his money behind it, or he was involved in any way.
A question that seemed to pose itself at the time was that these contracts were being awarded to the major sort of powers as if each of them had a sort of a predetermined share in the transactions that were being granted. A car factory with the U.S., a car factory with Britain, another one with France. Did you see it?
Well, I think we saw it a little bit like that the Shah was sort of a balancing act, I mean, but after all, that's been, it's in the Persian blood, isn't it? I mean, it's been, balancing one power against another, and I think that the Shah enjoyed doing that sort of thing. And of course, the question of who represented these firms. So, I mean, I never got to the bottom of the extent to which Princess Ashraf was involved, but the general belief was unless you had Ashraf or her son Shahram involved, you weren't going to get any business. And whether that was true or not, I don't know. When I was asked whether firms should bring in Ashraf, I tended to say no. I mean, not quite no, but I'd say, well, I would keep out of it. But in fact, I think they found that they had in some way or other to get somebody like Ashraf involved.
Again, another question that continues to come up in Iranian politics is the extent of U.S.-British rivalry-cooperation.
Yeah.
Could you sort of set this question straight? What was the extent of rivalry and cooperation?
Well, as I said yesterday, in the early days when I went back in 1953, the cooperation was very close because the oil companies, the American oil companies, far from wishing to see BP kicked out of the country, they stood solid behind them and wouldn't buy Persian oil, stolen oil they called it, because the American companies saw that if this happened to the British company in Iran, it would probably happen to them next in Saudi Arabia or somewhere. So the great myth in Britain, at any rate, is the Americans got us out, is I think, untrue. There had been an unfriendly ambassador before. I think Grady was unfriendly towards us and may have encouraged Mossadegh. But by the time I got there, and I'm talking about my time, not about them, the Americans were very helpful, and we got the oil agreement in which BP had 40% share. Now, when I went back as ambassador in '63, although I got on very well with Julius Holmes in particular, and he'd served in London, he knew the British and so on, the Americans were very much the top power then, and the British were no longer even in the position we were in 1953. But I enjoyed, as I mentioned yesterday, just because of past history, a sort of rather special position in Iran, as British ambassador, and the fact I'd been there in 53, 55, and knew a lot of people. And I sensed certain jealousy of my position, particularly by Armin Mayer. Douglas MacArthur I had very little use for at all. I mean, he was all friendly and all the rest of it, but I mean, he was just a gas bag, on my judgment, and I never found him easy to work with. But with the American embassy as a whole, the British embassy got on well, and there was no feeling on my part, at any rate, that they were trying to steal marches on us. And of course there was a competition over exports and on arms in particular. And I remember when the British did get a big order, I think, I'm not certain it was for rapier, I wanted to tell the American embassy, because it seemed to me that the Americans were primarily responsible for military supplies, and we should tell them in interest. I wasn't allowed to, and I remember sending a telegram to the Labour government saying, if the export of arms is your only consideration, all right, but it does seem to me, in terms of Anglo-American cooperation, we should inform the Americans. But the Americans had done some dirty work, I think, elsewhere, and mustering in on arms deals which we got. But I wasn't allowed to tell the Americans. But as far as my own position in Iran was concerned, throughout all my period there was no feeling of trying to steal a march on the American. It was worth keeping in step with them and not allowing the Iranians to play us off one against the other, which was they were inclined to do.
Mm-hmm. My next question is concerns certain arrests of prominent government officials under the banner of corruption. Although some Iranians tended to believe that if a high government official was ever arrested for corruption, it had to do with certain disloyalty or misjudgment in the area of politics. And the three names that crop up during your stay in Iran, one is Ahmad Nafisi, who was mayor of Tehran.
Yeah.
The other one is Mr. Ibtihaj, who was arrested, I believe, before you arrived there.
Yeah.
Was perhaps released while at the time that you arrived. And the third one was General Ahmad Lusuk, who I believe was a senior military officer, and maybe even Minister of War. Do you have any thoughts or reflections on these?
Well, yes. Well, let me talk about Ibtihaj, the first one, because I know Ibtihaj very well. And when I went back to Tehran as ambassador, he had, of course, been in prison and been released and so on. But he was very upset because he wasn't invited to the Queen's birthday party. It was extraordinary how people mind about these things. And he sent a message to me through Miss Palmer Smith, who, as I mentioned yesterday, that he hadn't been invited. So I looked into this, and he was on our list. I mean, he either hadn't got the invitation and so on, and there was no question of leaving him off. So this message went back, and then I got a message that he was convinced that it was the British who had been responsible for having him arrested and so on. So I said I was quite certain this was untrue, but I think I talked to him about this, and I said, but I'll look into this whole question. So I dug out the files, and I found a lot about it, and what Ibtihaj had not told me, he had written to his old friend, the cabinet minister, Lord Casey, C-A-S-E-Y, whom he'd known in the war, complaining about this and saying it was the British who had been responsible. And Casey, who was now dead, but had then written, he was in Australia, I think he's Governor General, had written to Alec Douglas Hume about this, and there'd been quite an inquest into this whole thing of Ibtihaj, and Alec Douglas Hume had written back and said there's absolutely no substance in this at all. Well, I found these on various minutes in the embassy files saying, you know, what an ass Ibtihaj is to believe these things. So I got hold of Ibtihaj and I said, look, I think the best thing is you to come and look at these papers and you can see yourself there's some quite rude things about you being so stupid as to believe this. But I said, so he came into my office and I showed him these papers. I don't think it ever convinced him, but nevertheless, that is the Ibtihaj case. You see, Ibtihaj, for all his cleverness and so on, he's got this old world Persian mentality. The British have this thing. And he had serious trouble in his early days when he was a junior clerk in the old Imperial Bank of Persia. And he always thinks that from then onwards, the British were against him. Well, as I told you yesterday, the one person I once told the Shah we had a great admiration for was Ibtihaj. We've never in the embassy held this sort of thing against him. We always thought he was a good straight man with a dynamism which was doing good things for Persia. So that's for Ibtihaj. Ahmed Nafisi, I had come across when he was mayor, and I almost certain that, well, I'm not certain, but from what Alam told me, it was Piraste, who was Minister of the Interior, who went to the Shah with allegedly information against Nafisi and had him arrested and put in prison. And it was entirely a personal thing between Piraste. This was told me by Alam, because I used to see his wife. She was a deputy, I think, and what I'd seen of Ahmed Nafisi, I rather liked him, and I didn't know him in my first time in Tehran, but the second time. And what the Piraste had against him, I don't know, but Alam told me this was you might say a dirty bit of work by Piraste. Mm-hmm. Certainly the British had nothing involved. We had no particular interest in him at the time. The other one, I don't know anything about at all. No, I don't know that. When did that happen?
That happened in March '64 when he was first arrested, and then sentenced to prison several months later.
Yeah.
For
no, I'm not aware of that at all.
Well, the point I was trying to make was that it hadn't occurred to me that the British had anything to do with this, but I was wondering if you could reflect on the Persian view that these people got themselves in trouble with the Shah because of some political indiscretion, rather than because they had acted, in some corrupt fashion.
Yeah.
And
Ibtihaj, I don't know. I think there were so many people gunning for Ibtihaj. I don't know what the reason, because I wasn't there when he actually went to prison. Nafisi, I just can't think of any reason at all. There was, of course, another case of a man demoted or dismissed and then sent to as ambassador to Spain with General Jam, which was in 1970 or 71.
Are you familiar with that case?
Well, only to the extent that it was some other general who was jealous of Jam and who went to the Shah and denounced him as having taken on giving decorations in his own name instead of the Shah's name, or talking about the Shah as my brother. There was something like that, one of these, but again, very indicative of the pettiness of the Shah on these things. I mean, in British view, and I think in American view too, the General Jam was regarded as one of the best chief of staff the Iranians had had. I mean, a chap who got a straight-thinking chap, and was just suddenly pushed out and sent to Madrid as ambassador.
But again, neither the British or the Americans were in a position to voice any sort of a displeasure or.
You wouldn't do that sort of thing. I mean, that was the Shah's decision, and you might dislike it very much, and we were very upset by it, and so I think we're Americans. But no possible good would have been, much harm might have been done by voicing any displeasure. I mean, the Shah would never go into reverse.
My next question has to do with opposition to the Shah, which we discussed yesterday, and also has to do with this issue of political development and possible sort of gradual move toward democracy in Iran, and also has to do with the fact that one reason why the religious forces were able to take over in Iran is because all the other possibilities of political alternative were removed from the scene. Now, in 63, 64, of course, we've talked about it, were those riots, which were, you know, of a different variety than the rest I'm going to mention. But at that time, what notice, if any, did you take of Khomeini? Was he just an isolated individual or a potential leader of
No, we didn't touch. Looking through some of the Foreign Office papers the other day, on Monday, I see he's mentioned as having been released from exile, from prison, and then been rearrested after the American Immunities Bill criticism, I think, in October. And then I didn't see any other reference. There were only two references I came to him, but he was important enough a figure to be mentioned by name in my two dispatches. And then I remember, and I have to look up, it must have been when he was released from prison, I went down to Qum. We had some friends staying with us, Sir Frank Lee, who was at that time master of Corpus Christi, Cambridge, and he and his wife, and I used to like going to Qum. It was, you'd always had to be rather careful how you behave there and put your wife in chador and so on. But it was very much a Persian town, and I took Sir Frank Lee and his wife down there one Sunday, or maybe no, I don't know, it was Sunday or what. And there were taxis galore going down there with mullahs in it, and I couldn't make out what it was, and this was when Khomeini had been released and returned to Qum, I think. And I remember thinking, now, if the Shah hears I have been in Qum this day, again, he will think the British ambassador. So I sent word through Alam, I think, that I'd taken visitors down to Qum and so on. But that was the only thing. But there's no recollection in my mind of ever regarding Khomeini as a potential leader. I mean, he went off to exile in Turkey and then to Iraq.
Yes.
And when I left Iran, he was in Iraq and was broadcasting fairly regularly. And I do remember that the Le Monde correspondent, Eric Rouleau, I think it was I went out to see the Shah shortly before the Persepolis thing. I'd left Tehran, but it must have been sort of the spring of, or the summer of 1971. And he said to the Shah, aren't you worried about these broadcasts of, and Shah dismissed it as no importance, and went on to say, on dit. One says that he's a member of the British Intelligence Service. I mean, there was a Shah sort of, in his own mind, this was the British again, you see, were trying to upset Persepolis. But we never, certainly my day, and I don't think my successors, ever attached any great importance to Khomeini as a potential leader of opposition.
Now, following this Khomeini affair, certain leaders of the National Front were brought before a military court, and also Mr. Mehdi Bazargan and Ayatollah Talabani were brought before military courts and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, which in a way put an end to that group for for at least 13 years, and I'm wondering if at that time any sort of a thought was given as to what the repercussions of this kind of behavior toward relatively moderate non-revolutionary.
When did that happen?
This is in 64.
64. I can't remember any paying any attention. I would have noticed it, I think, in my looking through the annual reports on Monday at the Foreign Office, and I can't remember. I don't think there was any reference to it at all.
Mm-hmm. And then in 71, it was sort of the first of a series of executions of sort of the young leftists began, when 13 members of what they call sort of Chinese-type communists who had apparently allegedly plotted something were executed.
I think so.
I guess the question I'm trying to ask you is in two parts. One is whether you saw any threat to the long-term stability of Iran with the actions that were being taken against moderate political forces who wanted to were really constitutionalists, at least at that time. And then that's one point. The second point is, as ambassador of the country which is probably the most democratic in the world, did you feel any sort of a conflict between what your own values in your own country were and what was being practiced in the host country? In what way did you resolve this in your own mind?
Yeah. Well, I don't think those years I was there, this question worried me at all. First of all, one was delighted to see that the chaos and weakness and instability of earlier years, which I'd experienced in 53, 55, had largely been overcome. And that from 1963, after the Muharram riots, as comes out continually in my annual reports, there was stability and the Shah was moving forward. And I think that was, for me, the main consideration, that the fact that he had to be tough with dissidents, whether they were the mullahs or the other, was a sign that he was got a grip of the country. And so I was never worried, and I can't recollect ever having warned London that the Shah was building up trouble for himself, other than that I quoted those two last dispatches I wrote from Tehran in April and March 1971, when I said there was trouble on the university front and there would be trouble ahead. But I never attempted to prophesy serious trouble ahead. I always thought then that the Shah would be wise enough to gradually let up and move towards a more liberal regime, that he would be strong enough to do so.
But the fact was that during your stay there, instead of gradually opening up during those years, he was gradually, at least as far as politics was concerned, he was gradually closing up and concentrating more and more power in his own hands.
Well, he was to some extent, but there were, let's see, some signs. I mean, the press, I think, became a little bit more critical at times, just towards the end of my stay there. But I personally felt that the Iranian people, rather like the Greek people, were basically an undisciplined country, and they needed a firm hand. And therefore, to me, it was a good thing the Shah was showing this hand. And it didn't seem to me then, talks with hindsight now, that Savak had resorted to the sort of practices which developed over the years. So don't forget that it wasn't until the very end of 1970 or the beginning of 71 that there was this guerrilla attack at Siak Kal, which we talked about yesterday, and that the urban guerrilla movement had really not started. So this wasn't there in my day, and this didn't worry me.
Own successor as ambassador had expected it to be. On the average, how often would you?
I should think one probably saw him, apart from at official receptions and dinners for visiting dignitaries and so on, perhaps 4 times a year, something like that, 4 or 5 times a year, if that. I should think that was about it.
Yep.
I told you that Mr. Aram was very anxious I should see the Shah regularly, but that was because Aram wanted some moderating influence on the Shah, but I was not prepared to get caught up with the court in that way.
And the setting would be which? Would be an audience in his...
Yes, it would be an audience at a palace, Marble Palace, or up at Sadabad, and there'd be nobody else present, except, of course, if there was a visiting minister. For Sir Alec Douglas Hume came out just after I arrived in 1963. He had a little working dinner at the palace with him and his staff, Alec Douglas Hume's staff and so on, the foreign minister. That would happen occasionally, but in terms of direct audience, it would be 4 or 5 times a year, I suppose, and they would be quite long audiences, and one would cover a lot of ground. I think I had one meeting with him at Farhabad. I got a message from Alam that wished to see me, and it was on it was on oil, some crisis, but that was the only time. I mention that because the American embassy had a belief that I used to ride regularly with the Shah every Friday, and this was quite untrue. I never went riding with the Shah. It was with Alam, but misdeveloped, and the Americans had this belief that I was riding every week with the Shah. One particular occasion is worth mentioning, that when the Duke of Edinburgh came out to Iran on his way to Australia on an unofficial visit as a guest of the Shah, I've forgotten the year it was now, but 1966 or 67, I think. He said he would like to entertain the Shah at the embassy. He was staying in one of the Shah's guest houses. And I asked the protocol people, whether the Foreign Office who were arranging the program, and they said, oh no, the Shah will never go to a foreign embassy unless it's a state visit. So when I next saw Alam, I told him that this had been vetoed. And he said, oh, he'll come to the British Embassy. So he said, I'll write to him. The Shah was in Switzerland, I think, and he wrote, and the answer was, yes, the Shah would be very happy to come to dinner at the British Embassy. So I had a dinner party for Duke of Edinburgh and the Shah, and we had 6 men on the Iranian side, 6 Iranians and 6 British. And it was a very successful party. I mean, the Duke of Edinburgh was in very good form, and he and the Shah got on very well. A small dinner, and we went on till past midnight, and it was just a very happy evening. And now
How were the 6 Iranians chosen? How were the 6 Iranians chosen? Was that easy?
Yes, I can tell you who they were. I've got the switch off for a minute. The date of the dinner was the 24th of February, 1967. And on the Iranian side, the Shah, the Prime Minister, who was Hoveyda, the Grand Master of Ceremonies, who I've forgotten who he was at that time, Prince Ghulam Reza, Minister of Foreign Affairs was Zahidi, and a Minister of Court, Alam. And
on the British side?
British side, there was Charles Wiggin, who was a councillor. There was Commander Martin. He was a retired naval officer who had been ADC to the Queen, and he and his wife were staying with us. And Mrs. Martin had been brought up with the Queen. They were great personal friends. And Commander Martin's father had been an admiral and had served under the Duke of Edinburgh had served under him in the Navy, so that was a link. They were friends, and they just. And then there was Mr. Orr, who was a private secretary of the thing, and that was it. Oh, and Jeffrey Dawson, who was a member of my staff, and Charles Wiggin, the two members of my staff. And the placement, which was arranged by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, put the Shah in the middle of the table, opposite the Duke of Edinburgh. And but it was a very hilarious evening. And the interesting thing was, on security, I was a bit worried. I didn't tell the servant, the cook, until the morning. I just told him we had a dinner at the Duke of Edinburgh. Didn't say the Shah was coming. And, but I also asked the court how many people I should have to provide meals for, security and so on. And they said just 3 people. I mean, there was no great mass.
The Imperial Guard didn't come
no,
in the first place.
And the 3 people who came, let me just get the thing out of my diary, switch off for a minute. I'll read from my diary. 8 p.m., 24th of February. Men's dinner for the Prince and the Shah. Other guests were Prince Ghulam Reza, the Prime Minister, Azdur Alam, Ardashir Zahidi, Dr. Lokman Adham, he was the Master of Ceremonies, Toby Martin, who arrived to stay that morning, Charles Wiggin, Jeffrey Dawson and James Orr. Went remarkably well, with Prince Philip quite sparkling in his conversation, and he and the Shah exchanging views, and ourselves chipping in, all very relaxed. HIM, who arrived promptly at 8:30 p.m., stayed until 11:30 p.m. Jane and Bill Winter, Jane was my wife's social secretary, and Bill gave dinner in the small dining room to General Kemal, Colonel Fartash, who were also part of the Shah's entourage. I mean, they were the 2 people who came with the Shah, but apart from that, we had no...
How did he arrive, by car? Or?
By car, yeah.
By car.
And it was never publicized. I mean, nobody ever knew. It never got ever came out. But I think it's the only time he ever went to a foreign embassy without it being a state visit.
Really? Now, on these occasions where you would see him at the palace, presumably could you describe the scene of how you would be greeted and how you would be sitting or standing?
Well, Shah would probably be standing up waiting for me, because I'd be kept waiting a few minutes in the anteroom, and when I came in he would be standing.
Would you be announced?
Yes, I think the Master of Ceremonies, whoever was looking after me, would announce it. But no great formality, and you just go in and you bow over his hand, and then he'd show you to a chair, and he would be another one at his desk probably, and a servant would come in with a cup of tea.
So he would be sitting behind his desk?
He might be sitting behind a desk. I can't really remember that, but the desk would be nearby at any rate, and we would be rather like you and I are here, talking like this, and he would. We would have our tea, and then we would, if I had stuff to say, or he might begin the conversation. There would be a few exchanges of sort of, almost not compliments, but how are you, and all that sort of thing. And I always found it very easy to talk to him. I mean, he hadn't got much sense of humour, but you could talk to him. His English was very good and lucid, and I had no difficulty in getting him to understand what I was trying to put across. And I, of course, used to have notes before I went up. I never had them out with me when I went to bed. I would very carefully rehearse what I was going to say so that I didn't forget any points, because you might have a dozen different points to talk about. And I have, in fact, I kept the very last interview I had with the Shah. You might like me to just, if you could switch off for a minute, I'll get it. We're switched on, are you? Yeah. I kept the very last notes I had, because I always prepared notes before I went up for an audience. So
would you also get briefs or instructions from the foreign office?
Well, it depended on what I was talking about, and sometimes yes and sometimes no. But in this case, I mean, more often than not, if it was a specific subject, yes, it would be talking to a foreign office brief. Now, I've got here the almost illegible notes I took up on my last audience with the Shah on the 17th of April 1971. And the first item was about the islands, that's Tuman Abu Musa and the Union of Arab Emirates, which was still unsettled. I mentioned this all yesterday. And I emphasize, and my notes go little a, speaking on instructions. In other words, I said to the Shah, now I'm talking on the instructions from the Foreign Secretary. Now my notes read as follows: Secretary of State, disturbed if no solution found. Islands likely to assume significance out of all proportion to their importance. Little 2, HMD's protection will be maintained and seen to be effective until our relation with the rulers changes. In other words, what I was saying to the Shah is that we would be bound to honor our obligations, and if he were to suddenly seize the islands, we should have to retaliate. I can't quite read this. Then, unstable condition, e.g. United Nations. I can't remember what that refers to. Then my third point of talking about the islands under instructions, seizure of the islands by force will destroy Persians' cooperation with the Persian Gulf rulers. Fourthly, the firm conclusion, therefore, must be a compromise must be reached. HMG worked hard. Signs of some move by the rulers. Distressed by HIM's 16th of February statement. I can't remember what that was. It's something the Shah had said which had upset things. Publicity makes harder for them to negotiate and will stir up premature hostile reaction. In other words, I was trying to say to the Shah, for God's sake, handle this thing carefully and don't make. And then my fourth point, hope the Persians will follow any initiative likely to lead to negotiations, and hope HIM will trust the rulers, treat the rulers gently, and not underline, insist that solution is temporary. The next point, the UAE, the Union of Arab Emirates, single most important contribution to the Persian Gulf stability. In other words, I was trying to say that if we could get this organization going, which the Iranians were opposing them, this would contribute to stability in the area. Point out that it was only the People's Democratic Republic of the Yemen and the Persian government who were opposing this. So I was really saying to Shah, look at it. The next point is something to do with the United Nations. Fallacy of the United Nations likely to create difficulty if no Arabs will, I can't read this, in getting inscription. I think trying to discourage him from taking this thing to the United Nations. And then the other subjects, that was my main thing. But then I had other subjects. The next one was copyright. I consistently tried to get the Shah to agree to sign some international copyright agreement. So I had another go at him and quoted that even Roger Stevens's book had been pirated, and Longman's English course was pirated and other things. And the Shah, in fact, I got him so worked up on this. I pointed out that Iran was the only civilized nation in the world hadn't signed. He got through on the telephone there and then to his brother-in-law, Mr. Palbod, who was Minister of Culture, and talked to him in Persian, saying that he didn't say I was with him, and just said, I hear we haven't signed, we're the only civilized nation, you must do something about it. Well, I'll come back to that in a minute. And then the next point I made was on our consular relations. I said it was important that they should have good relations with the local authorities because of various drug smuggling and that sort of thing. And then I mentioned St. Anthony's, because St. Anthony's College, I had sent out someone, Cecil Hourani, to try and get some money out to set up Persian studies. And I said to the Shah at the end of the audience that I had never asked him any personal favours. He sort of sat up and I said, well, I'm an old Oxford man and I'm interested in St. Anthony's because they've got a Middle East centre where Persian goes by default in a way, because there's no... And I would hope that he would be able to put up some money to help with Persian studies. And he said, well, we've already helped another college. It was Wadham. I said, yes, the wrong college. I said, it's got nothing to do. And there's another story I won't bore you with. And then I talked about another point I had, the myths about the British, and I've got Baathists. I think the Shah at that time thought we were supporting the Baathists in Iraq, and I tried to explode that one. And then I had another point, chieftain tanks and the status of forces. Telling him that British teams of engineers and soldiers were arriving in September. By the time I had left, I said there'd be 25 or so, and it was important that there be some protection, under legal protection, for these people when they're in Iran. I just mentioned this as coming business, not for me to negotiate. And I said that what we would want would be British personnel, UK personnel, but really asking for the same treatment as the Americans got, the MAG, their military mission. And then I talked about the Navy, saying that nothing had been done to establish basic use or mechanized type facilities at Bandar Pahlavi. Must give higher priority to training skills for Navy, because the British were building ships and we were worried they were not training people properly. And that was the sort of agenda I would have for that last audience. And so on previous occasions I would go up there with a little bit of paper in my pocket and go through whatever I had to talk about.
Presumably, once you got back to the embassy, you wrote a report to the Foreign Office.
Through the Foreign Office.
About the Saudis.
By courier or by telegram. It was sufficiently urgent, but normally by courier.
Now, as far as you knew, on the Persian side, how was this information, this discussion, ever either put down on paper or communicated to the responsible officials?
Well, I always assumed that the Shah he used to see his ministers daily. I mean, those are the important ones, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Prime Minister, that he would issue instructions to them when he next saw them. But I never knew exactly how it was done.
For instance, did you see him take notes?
No, he never took notes.
So
he had a remarkable memory.
He had to rely on his so-called remarkable memory.
Yeah.
There was no secretary called into the room during the meeting or afterwards to take things down.
The only time he had secretaries present was when if I took the foreign minister up there, or something like that. I mean, Michael Stewart doing it, and there would be a sort of a meeting. Then there would be someone taking notes. But when I had my single audiences with him, there'd be nobody else present.
Well, you see the point I'm driving at. On your side, one man, you would be there. You would have a brief. You would discuss things. Then you would write a report. It would be looked at by a handful or maybe a dozen people back in the UK.
Yeah.
People of intelligence, experience, and then it would be mimeographed and Xeroxed, and people would see it. On the Iranian side, it would depend on the Shah remembering what you had said and the person before and after you had said about that, and then remembering to pass it on to the various individuals.
Yeah.
I mean, he had to do the job of a Xerox machine.
Oh, yes. No, it's quite true. And how he did it, I don't know. And I never really worried because one never had any reason to doubt that he followed up the important things one went to see him about. I mean, one always seemed to get. I mean, I don't know what happened to those things because I left, but when I went to see him on other things, one normally, the things had been followed up. And in the case of the copyright, I mean, he telephoned when I was there to Palbard, and I went to say goodbye to Palbard a few days later, and I took up the question of copyright with him, which I always had. And he led on that the Shah, I didn't tell him I was with the Shah when it happened. And in the end, of course, nothing happened because I think there were too many vested interests in copyright in Iran. And there was also a sort of feeling, well, we've been exploited by the British and the West for so many years. Let's exploit them for a change. You know, I mean, I think there was, somebody told me this the other day. I mean, this was Hoveyda's attitude, really. That,
but did you normally inform Iranian officials about your discussions with the Shah?
It would depend if it was going to be useful to do so. I mean, if I talked about Bahrain or something like that, or the islands, I would certainly have told Afshar if that was if the negotiations were still on, or if it was something concerning Zahedi, I would tell him, and very often I would go and tell Hoveyda because one knew there was this rivalry between them, and so my objective was to try and keep all my contacts friendly towards me and not let them feel I was leaning towards one. I mean, if I went and did something with Alam, I would cover myself by going to Hoveyda or Zahedi to make certain they knew what I was up to and couldn't ever accuse me of going behind their backs.
So therefore, this coordination vacuum, if I may call it that, on the Iranian side was to some degree filled by...
well, to some extent, yes. Yeah, to some extent, yeah.
Now, were you concerned that you may be passing on a decision made by the Shah to the foreign minister before the Shah is ready to pass it on to the foreign minister himself?
Well, I mean, one had to be very careful what one said. I mean, for instance, I told you about yesterday about the Bahrain things. Well, he told me to deal with Afshar, and I therefore never said a word to either Alam or to Zahedi about it, or anybody else. Kept it entirely. I know that, and I was very careful never to repeat to the Shah what sometimes his own ministers said to me, and I know that my successor greatly upset Alam by something that Alam had said to him, which he repeated to the Shah, and the Shah was very angry with Alam, you see, and it seemed to me it's just common sense. If you want to keep a man's confidence, you don't repeat what he's told you unless it's very good reason to do so, and it's not going to lead to repercussions, because I was, I think, perhaps more aware than certainly my successor, Ramsbottom, that what a difficult character the Shah was, and how very carefully you had to tread and not praise any of his own people, because that would only be a kiss of death in some way for them.
Initially, when you went to Iran in '53, you refused to deal with the Shah directly, and obviously by the time you left, or when you returned as ambassador, and then certainly by the time you left, you were in fact dealing directly. I mean, the answer is fairly obvious, but I'd like to have you...
Well, they're two different positions. I mean, I went out as a fairly humble chargé d'affaires with a very low opinion of the Shah. I mean, a low opinion of the General Foreign Office view. Shah couldn't be trusted entirely, and my job wasn't to do any highfalutin business. It was to take soundings and find out, and on that, the sort of brief I had was not one which was to go to the Shah about things. So there was absolutely no hesitation in my mind that the way to deal with this was... But by the time I got back in '63, I mean, the Shah was in power. He was a foreign minister in many ways, and one was on all these issues, one learned from experience, you had to carry the Shah with you. So it was a very different situation, really.
Recently, a book has been published by, I think, a Polish journalist called The Emperor, and it talks about the court of Haile Selassie.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen that or not.
I read it.
When you went from Ethiopia to Iran, were there any similarities at all as far as the court and the Shah and the two kings were concerned, their mode of behavior, people around them, or were they?
Well, there was a certain similarity, but of course the Ethiopian court was much more medieval than the Iranian court. There were similarities. I mean, the emperor was his own foreign minister. The ministers were like officials in England or in America. And if you had any serious business, you had to deal with the emperor and nobody but the emperor. So there were similarities. And I think I said yesterday, just as I tried to avoid being identified with the court in Iran, so I tried to keep away from being regarded as the sort of a man around the palace in Addis Ababa, because it didn't do one any good at all. I don't think there was the extent of corruption around the court in Addis Ababa, but that was because it was a much poorer country. There wasn't the big business, there wasn't the oil money coming in and so on. So although there were people there who were making a certain amount of money, it wasn't the same sort of corruption that went on there. And the other thing was, of course, one had less opportunity for social contact the Ethiopians very rarely were invited to their houses, and there was no mystique about the British power there that there was in Iran. I mean, it was a different sort of position for the British altogether.
How would you compare the two leaders as
Well, there was a great age difference between them. They were both shrewd operators. I think the Shah was probably more in touch with his own country than the emperor was. But communications, you see, in Ethiopia were so very poor indeed. It was difficult for the emperor to get around the country much. And he hadn't got the highly trained sort of people as there were in Iran. I mean, there were a number of highly trained Western people. There was in Ethiopia the number of Western trained technocrats and so on was very limited. It was a very different sort of setup in a way, but the two courts had certain things in common.
The Shah made a visit to England in 1970. I think it was an official visit. And
1970, didn't it?
Yeah. Was there anything special about that? I forgot to bring that up while we were covering that period.
I can't remember that visit at all. He came in 1965, didn't he? I mean,
yeah.
But 1970, I can't remember.
Okay.
Yeah.
My other question has to do with whether any other British official, and by that I mean head of your military, I don't know if you had a head of military mission or whether it was just the military attaché in the embassy.
Yeah.
Your top military man, local man, your top intelligence officer, whether they had direct access to the Shah or whether they had to go through you.
The military, we had no military mission there. I just had a military attaché, and he didn't see the Shah. But the head MI6 man did have access to the Shah, just like the CIA man. In fact, he used to see the Shah more often than I did. But he would never see him without coming to see me first and going through with me what he was going to talk about. And likewise, when he'd seen the Shah, he would come and report to me straight away. So I kept fairly close tabs on this. And I didn't mind this. The Americans, political counsel, rather resented this sort of access. So I didn't mind it. I didn't want to see the Shah too often, and it served quite a useful purpose, really. I could get messages to him that way.
I realize the sensitivity of this question, but this is my last one on the subject. Did he get involved in domestic politics with the Shah, or was it mainly to do with security?
Mostly dealing with the Russian threat and security.
He wouldn't get involved with questions of national front or domestic politics or the Majlis or that.
No, he wouldn't. No.
That would be outside of
Yeah.
Now, in May 1971, I suppose you had left by then. There was a published report that Iran was threatening to shoot down British planes if they came over the islands. Is that, first of all, is this accurate? And second, was this some kind of a show, or was
yes.
This real?
It could be. I'd gone by then. I can't remember that particular one, but you see, the whole question of the island was being negotiated. Sir William Luce had been brought out of retirement to handle this, and there was some question of keeping me on beyond my age of 60 to stay on till we settled this whole thing. And I heard later from the Foreign Office that it had been decided that this might drag on for a long time, and therefore better let me off the hook. But I can't remember that particular incident, but there were some hard things said. I mean, there was one of my complaints against Upshur, which was that at the dinner of the Iran Society later that year, let's see, it must have taken in the summer, I've forgotten the actual date, but it used to take in the autumn, but it was before the islands were settled, and there was a dinner at which Princess Alexandra was present. And it was, in those days, the Iran Society was a very flourishing body because we had a dinner at the Savoy every year, and it was packed out 500 or maximum seats, 550 or something. And Upshur made a speech which, it's meant to be a non-political society, where he talked about the islands and that unless British did something, the Iranians would take action. You know, a very provocative speech. And if I'd been Princess Alexandra, I think I would have walked out. And so it all ties up with that threatening to shoot down aeroplanes. I remember I was very embarrassed by this speech because they were there, the head of the Foreign Office was there, the head of BP was there, and all people I've been trying to say, now look, the Iranians are moving in the right direction. Here was Upshur putting down the gauntlet. And I remember the press attaché at the Iranian embassy, Shahpurian, coming after me after the dinner and saying, what did I think about Upshur's speech? I said, this is the most disgusting performance I'd heard for a long time. But he went and told Upshur. Upshur never forgave me for that, I think, because Iqbal came down. He was at the dinner, and Iqbal came down here the following Sunday for lunch, and he said to me, I didn't raise it with him, he said, I didn't like Upshur's speech. I thought something would be thought of very malplacé. I said I thought it was a disgusting performance, and it really was out of place, and it would do more harm than good. And Iqbal said, I'm going to tell the Shah when I go back. And Upshur got into trouble. He always thought I was responsible. It wasn't me, it was Iqbal who did it. But so the island thing was a very acute sort of issue until it was finally...
I guess the question I was addressing is whether during that time there were certain statements made that both sides knew were just for public consumption rather than being said in seriousness. Was there any sort of a scenario that perhaps...
No, I don't think there was. I say I wasn't in the picture anymore, but...
As far as you were concerned.
Yes, no. I mean, in the end, of course, we agreed with the Iranians that they would get the islands, but there was no sort of synchronized sort of we'll make a tough statement, you make that. I don't think there was any of that at all.
A different subject, and when we were talking about your visit to Nassau, you asked me to ask you about Amir Sadeghi and his visit.
Well, I mentioned Amir Sadeghi because are you seeing him?
No, I'm not. I've never met him.
Yeah, because I'd never met Amir Sadeghi until sometime in before the revolution. He wrote to me from Tehran and said we had good friends in common. And he mentioned, I think, Shobakash and Feridun.
Who is he? His father was...
he was a chauffeur
for the
Shah.
But he himself had been educated?
He was educated over here at, I think, School of Economics.
Right? I see.
Any rate, he wrote to me and said that he was going to produce a book on 20th century Iran or something, and he wished me to contribute to it and also be editor. And I wrote back and said I was very sorry. I was too busy. I was writing my own book, and I wouldn't have the time to do anything about it. Well, he wouldn't take no for an answer, and he came over to London, and I gave him a drink at the Travellers Club, and he charmed me with his personality. And in the end, I said, well, what I will do, I will write the introduction. I won't be editor, but I will write it, the subject of seeing all the articles. The same thing I made about that book on agriculture, land reform. But I said, and I also helped him, gave him names, because he had a list of people he was going to get to contribute. He'd got from Alistair Buchan, who's now dead, but was at Oxford, a professor of international relations. And he had a very good list of names. And I gave him some other names, one or two people in America and so on. And I also suggested that Ronald Ferrier at BP might be the person who could do the editing. Well, the long and short of it was that book came out, and I did do an introduction to it, a short introduction. He wanted a much longer one. It was, as far as I could make out, financed by the Shah, but he had been given this opportunity to get more controversial articles, and if this didn't take off, well, it had been fine, but it was an attempt to do the sort of thing saying to Shah, for God's sake, don't have these propaganda books. Anyway, next thing he did was wanted to write a book about the Shah, and he wanted the Duke of Edinburgh to do the introduction. And he asked me whether I could help. I said, not in your life. You write to the palace or get the Shah or somebody to write. And he got turned down. So he then wrote to Lord Carrington, who was then not Foreign Secretary, but was president of the Iran Society. And Carrington, who's a friend of mine and lives quite close here, he sent me this correspondence and said, what shall I reply? So I said, don't touch this with a barge pole, because I said, in your position, you don't want to get involved in a book which is just be a panegyric of the Shah and all the royal family and so on. So Peter Carrington didn't do it, and in the end, Amir Sadeghi did the introduction himself. Well, so much for the introduction. I was increasingly skeptical about this chap, but then, at the time of the revolution, he suddenly appeared on TV. As being the sort of press man at the palace and so on, and seemed to have quite a position. And one day, after the revolution, and the Shah had left, the Shah was in Morocco, he telephoned me, and I thought he'd been left behind and been killed in Tehran. But he telephoned me and said, I've just come from Morocco. And what do you think about the Shah coming here? This was before any approach. And I straight off said, I don't think this is a good idea, because, you know what the Iranian suspicions are about the British. If we had the Shah here, there'll be no end of trouble, and we think we are intriguing with him, and I would be dead against him coming to England. And that was that. Well, then, I'd forgotten other, but after that, Amir Sadeghi came over to London and was, I don't know whether he got in touch with me again or what, but I was sufficiently intrigued by his position to try and find out what it was. So that's why I asked Kambiz Atabay what he thought about him. He said that he was a friend of the Shah Banus and had been in Nassau, And I asked the Shah, I didn't put it in my diary, but I did ask the Shah. I said, what about this man, Amir Sadeghi? And he said, he's a friend of the Empress, not of mine, something like that. So it was quite clear. Well, since then, Amir Sadeghi is in London. He lives in considerable style in Eaton Square or somewhere like that. About a year and a half ago, he asked me to lunch, and I was very surprised by the people he had there. He had the head of King's College London there, a retired Air Marshal, had the foreign editor of The Economist there. He had that man Anthony Sampson, who writes books about the arms question, he wrote about the oil question. And he seems to have a great deal of money. But I say he's just a bit too smooth and slippery. But I thought he might be a person you ought to interview.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll put it down.
Yeah.
Well, this is the last part of the interview, and I have a list of names, and I'm wondering if there are any of these names that recall any particular incident which you think would be important historically. Sayyid Hassan Taqizadeh, did you ever meet him while he was...
Taqizadeh, yes, I did, but he was so old and senile that one never... I went to call on him and talked to him at odd parties at the Senate or that, but he never got anything out of him at all.
Ali Sohaili.
Yes, I did, yes. He helped me, I think I told you, at this confrontation with the Shah in 1954 at Queen Soraya's celebration of her marriage. It was Sohaili who got hold of me and said, I'm going to make the Shah talk. And he took a very tough line with the Shah and made him talk. So I'm always very grateful to Sohaili. And then I used to see him in London occasionally, but when he was ambassador when I came on leave, and was always very friendly. He had a very curious wife, who was a white Russian, I think, a Georgian dancer, wasn't she? But she obviously been a very beautiful woman. But I remember she came one day to rushing around to the embassy, and with the passport of an Iranian cook, and she said, I want visa quickly for him to England. And this was because she suddenly got him to leave the German embassy, and she wanted to get him out of the country before the Germans could pay him a higher price. And then she came back to Tehran when he was ambassador in London, and gave a party for my wife and myself, and a sort of dancing party, and she said she wanted to have a long talk with me alone. I wonder what the hell it was. And we had dinner, or I arranged to give her dinner or lunch at the Residence, which was in the smart place.
Yeah.
And she turned up, this was in 1954, I suppose. She turned up late, but she turned up, and of course everybody knew everybody in Tehran in those days, and what was I doing with this woman in this place? And after a bit she said in her broken English, I want you to make me agent. And I thought, what's this, Matahari or something? I said, what do you mean? She said, I want good agent for English motor car company, for English pharmaceutical company. And she had a bit of paper, and she had Boots down, as Boots the pharmaceutical paper, and I've forgotten who the other two were, but there were three. And I said, what do you know about business? She said, but I have good partner, you see. And I don't know whether this man was her lover or what it was, but she was round next day to want to know my answer. And of course I said, of course we haven't got any such thing in our gift. But that was when she was wife of the personal ambassador in London.
Murtaza Wali Bayat, did you...
Was he the head of the NIOC? No, he was... I mean, he took part in the negotiations in 1954, but he was very much a figurehead, I think. I mean, the people who mattered were Rouhani and Nafisi, and I suppose, I don't know whether Fala took part in it then, but, they were the people. The Bayat didn't carry any weight.
Did you ever have any contact or association with Princess Asha, personally?
My first time I was in Iran, I had nothing to do with her at all. Now, when I left Tehran in October 1955 and handed over as chargé d'affaires, because Stevens hadn't come back from London, to a man called Titchener, Lanham Titchener, who was a commercial counsellor, and a man I personally disliked and distrusted. And to much my disgust, he was to be chargé d'affaires when attending Roger Stevens. And I remember saying to him, keep the royal family at arm's length, etc. Well, within a matter of days of my leaving, he was entertaining Ashraf in the embassy, and she was tied up with some big contract for roads or something. And so my answer is, I had nothing to do with her, and I kept at arm's length, but this man, Titchener, got involved with her. When I went back as ambassador, there was Allen and Hanbury were setting up a pharmaceutical plant for the Iranian government, and it was to be opened by the Shah just after I arrived back in Tehran sometime. And Princess Ashraf gave her a party for this Allen Hanbury. She was involved in some way. Yeah. And I got commanded to go to this party, which I did. And she also had a party for Lolo Gabrito when she was out, and she asked the American ambassador and myself with our wives, and we sat on the floor and that sort of thing, but it was a rather distasteful sort of party. It was never bad behavior. But those were the only two times. I never invited her to the embassy at all. But there was just one other. Oh, yes, I think I had to go and call on her officially just after I arrived, before going to this Allen and Hanbury thing, I think. And there was a woman who was a friend of hers who used to turn up skiing. She looked very Mongolian. I've forgotten her name now, but she was a part of that royal, rather corrupt entourage. And Princess Ashraf said to me, I have a friend of yours here waiting to see you. And she brought this girl, came in, and I didn't know her from before. I mean, I'd had no relations of any sort with her. What the game was, I don't know, but I remember Horace Phillips, who gave a party for me, saying the same girl had demanded that she be invited to his party for me. And whether she was hoping to I should become her lover or what it was, I don't know, but Ashraf had her, produced her. And I said, I'm very sorry, I just don't know this woman, and that was quite true. Yes. And that was the sole extent of my dealings with Ashraf.
Did you ever meet or know anything about Ayatollah Abul Qasim Kashani?
Kashani?
Yeah.
No.
Ayatollah Kashani.
Yeah.
He was president of the Majlis.
Yes, no. Yeah, no.
I mean, in any of your studies, did you ever come across his having been a especially good friend of Britain? This is another one of those myths that, he's anti-British on the one hand and the British on the other hand.
Never, no.
How about Dr. Muzaffar Baghai, who was a colleague of Mossadegh's and then fell out with Mossadegh?
Yes.
While you were there, he was sort of in semi-retirement.
Yes, I don't think I ever came across him. Certainly I didn't know.
Khalil Maliki, who was head of the socialists.
Yeah, no, never.
How about Sardar Fakhr Heshmat?
Yeah, he was a good friend of the British. He didn't talk a word of English, but why he was a friend to it, I never discovered. I mean, I used to be much embarrassed by Sardar Fakhr because he was a great friend of Sajadi, the man I mentioned has been in the embassy, the Oriental, and he used to give a lunch or dinner for my wife and myself, both, I think, when I was there as chargé d'affaires and again when I was ambassador. And they were very dreary affairs because he would have his son there, Dr. Hekmat, who now lives in Paris, and there was no English spoken. My Persian was not that fluent, and he had no real conversation at all. He also embarrassed me more than once by giving me a rug, quite an expensive rug and that sort of thing. But is that? No, let me. Okay. when I went out and got involved in trying to stop the Shah signing up with the Russians in 1959, I went to have tea with Sada Fakir then, with Sajadi, and he was, I remember, very worried about the Shah's dealings with the Russians. I mean, he wasn't involved, but he spoke to me, and I couldn't refresh my memory of my diary, but I did, he raised the subject with me, and on that occasion, I mean, this is the sort of thing he used to do. He gave me this box, you see, and you will see inside it there was a very nice edition of Saadi, you see, with a little inscription by, I think that's by him, you can read it.
کتاب گلستان و بوستان سعدی شیرازی را به دوست محترم جناب آقای دنیس رایت تقدیم می‌نماید که به یادگار در کتابخانه خود نگه دارند. رضا حکمت، اول اردیبهشت ماه 1335.
And you see, he was, and he never asked for any quid pro quo. I mean, he never asked any favors. Well, after I retired, he used to come over to London, and he would telephone, and I would arrange to see him. On one occasion, I've forgotten which year it was now, 1973 or 74, he telephoned, and I arranged for him to meet me at the Travellers Club for lunch. And I sent him a letter, because we did all this in Persian on telephone, and my Persian wasn't that good, so I wrote to him and confirmed this. Well, he misunderstood it. He couldn't even understand my English letter, you see. And I waited at the Travellers, he didn't come. And I was spending the night in London, I think. I've forgotten why, but for some reason. Well, my wife was here alone, and she had listened on the radio that day, evening news, and it said a dangerous criminal had escaped from Aylesbury prison, and householders were warned that be careful. Well, about 9 o'clock at night, there was a knock on the door, and she was a bit worried, but she thought she'd better go to the door. And this was Sada Fakir, who had taken a taxi all the way down from London, because he had then reread my letter, or got someone, and realized he'd made a mistake. He was so ashamed of himself, he decided he must come down and apologize. And so he got a taxi all the way from London. I mean, this was a man 80 years old. I was always very touched by this. And back he went to London. And he came over, went to hospital. I remember trying to find him in hospital. I couldn't. I went to see him, but he was, the hospital either misdirected me. I never found him there. But at any rate, I was on friendly terms with him, but could never understand quite why this devotion to the British, why he gave me expensive presents. I think couple of rugs. When I left Tehran on retirement, he sent me a most lovely rug and that sort of thing. So I did see him, and I think we regarded him in the embassy as probably not too happy with the Shah, but one of the more liberal of the old regime.
Mm-hmm. If I remember correctly, he was sort of booted out of office at the same time as Hussein Allah and Abdullah Intizam after that little meeting they had after that 15th of Mordad riot.
Was he then? I don't know when it was, yes. I thought it was some other time. I never associated him with that. It could be then.
How about Queen Soraya? Did you ever meet her?
Soraya?
Yeah.
Really only once at that wedding party. And she was off to Europe, you know, most of that summer of 1954 and or 55 when I left, and I never had any talks with her at all. She never struck me as more than a good-looking girl, but I don't think she got much interest in people.
Mm-hmm.
You start to say something about the last time you saw Hussein Allah when he was ill and was dying, and you said he was sort of died also of a broken heart. Did you speak with each other at that time? Was he well enough to?
Yes, I don't think he made any complaints, but we spoke to each other because Allah had he was a very loyal friend, really. He was although I think in that period 53, 55 we in the embassy regarded him with a certain amount of suspicion as being rather weak and so on. He remained a very good friend, and when the first piece of Persian pottery I ever received was a gift from Allah, my first Christmas or my second Christmas. And when I was in Addis Ababa, he used to sent me some collection of coins, both gold and silver. I mean, Sasanian and Islamic coins, which are now given to the Ashmolean Museum. But he never knew I was going to come back as ambassador. When I went there when he knew I was going as ambassador, later, I mean, after these little Christmas presents used to come, he wrote to me a very charming letter and sent a pair of turquoise cufflinks, which I normally wear. I haven't got them on today, but I normally have them on, turquoise, and say, "My dear Denis, this is to remind you of the azure sky which awaits your arrival in Persia." Well, when I went out there, I went to call on him before presenting credentials, he was Minister of Court, and he told me he was worried about some of the Shah's activities, I mean the land reform, and asked me to speak to the Shah. Well, I said, it's not for me to. This is not a British ambassador thing. But Allah was worried, right?
What aspect of the land reform?
Well, he didn't go into details, but he was, I can't remember it anyway. No. But he was looking to me to say something to the Shah to try and restrain him. And when he finally was dismissed, I wrote him a letter saying, well, I've got his, I can dig them out for you, like a copy of some of his letters he wrote to me. They were charming letters he used to write in beautiful English.
But nothing of political significance?
No.
How about General Taimur Bakhtiar? Did you...
Well, I mentioned...
talked about that yesterday.
Yes, I said...
While in Iran, while he was head of this...
No, I can't recall any special meetings with him or so. I wouldn't normally go and see him. You see, he was a military governor. It wasn't my business at all. And I don't remember entertaining him at all in the embassy. Well, I wasn't in the embassy as a councillor. Of course, in those days, a councillor was a person that people like Iqbal, anybody wanting to become Prime Minister, would be only too happy to have dinner even with the junior secretary in the British Embassy. It's a very curious situation. I mean, it had changed by the 1960s, but when the Iranians were much more standoffish. But in the 1950s, I mean, any Iranian invited to the British Embassy came like a shot because he thought this would lead to higher things.
How about General Hassan Pakhravan? Did you?
I knew him because he was a close friend of General Arthur and Mrs. Arthur, and one used to meet him up there on a Friday quite often. I used to go up there for their Friday lunches sometimes. And what I saw of Pakhravan I liked very much, but again I didn't have any official dealings with him at all.
Mm-hmm. How about his replacement, General Nasiri?
Yes, I thought he was a bit of an ass, really. I never thought much of Nasiri. And he once, just before, about a year or two before I left Tehran on retirement, he had asked us to dinner, my wife and myself. And there were various members of SAVAK there, and there was my sort of intelligence man there. Asadullah Alam was there. And after dinner, he'd got this young German wife, hadn't he, at the time? He put on a film, and I can't abide staying up late. I like to get to bed by 11 o'clock. And in Tehran, I used to make it a rule that if one diplomatic party, I mean, if the Dean of Diplomatic Corps, and I wasn't Dean, a Brazilian, and didn't leave by 11 o'clock, I used to go up and say, look, I'm very sorry, but I've got to go to bed. But this dinner, I went on, and then we had the first part of the film. And about 1 o'clock in the morning, when that was over, I decided I had enough, and so I left. I think he was a bit upset because there was still another part. But I find him, insofar as one had any dealings with him, and I say that was a sort of really rather stupid man. I didn't have much use for him.
That didn't really make sense to put someone as head of one's intelligence unit, a man who...
Well, that was only my judgment. I mean, it wasn't for me to tell the Shah he wasn't any good, but he may have been all right. He was very loyal to the Shah. I mean, he'd been the man hadn't he flown him out or gone with him to Baghdad?
He had served Mossad with...
Yeah, and you see, as I told you yesterday, that farewell dinner that the Shah gave for me in September 1955, he was present at that dinner. So, and when I went up, I flew up to Caspian to see the Shah just before I left Tehran in September or October 1955, again about the Baghdad Pact and all that. And I flew up in a little tiny aeroplane and landed on the shore at Noshar. Nasiri. He was there with a great Cadillac to meet me and take me to the Shah. He was always very close to the Shah.
How about Mr. Jafar Sharif from Ami? Did you have much?
Not much to do with him. I used to see him occasionally because he was running the Pahlavi Foundation, and I mentioned yesterday there was this question of a debt owed to cementation, which I had to go and see him about. And I may have seen him on other occasions, but I don't recollect anything particularly.
So one would expect that the British ambassador would see a lot of President of the Senate.
Well, why? Really, not particularly. I mean, I saw him at parties, but there was no my business with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, you see, or the Prime Minister, not with the President of the Senate.
Now, Dr. Amini, when you arrived the second time, had already been Prime Minister and was sort of out of favor.
Yeah, so I kept him at arm's length. I had him round to the dinner for Loudon, I mentioned yesterday. And we used to invite him to the Queen's birthday party, I think, but otherwise I didn't make contact with him.
Did you meet with anyone who sort of, any of the so-called opposition figures, such as Mehdi Bazargan or Ayatollah Talabani?
Not consciously, at any rate. I used to see, I think, Shahpur Bakhtiar at parties. I recognized his photo subsequently, but I didn't know who he was, and I not conscious of meeting what I call the real opposition at any time.
How about the former Queen, Shahbanu Farah? Did you have much contact with her?
Well, not much, but when my wife did a painting once of Fahabad, where she used to. I remember when we went. I don't know, it was when I finally left or when we were going on leave. I think when we were going on leave, we went to say goodbye to her. Then we had quite a talk, and she was saying then how she envied us being able to travel freely around the country and not being really recognized. She said, when I go, I have to be escorted everywhere, and I can't. But that was the sort of, I regarded her as a nice, modest, humble person, and who, from what one heard, was a restraining influence on the Shah in the early days. But I think that all vanished later.
My last question is regard to Mr. Hoveda. You've talked about him a little bit, but is there anything that has to do with him and his person or his tenure as Prime Minister, which you think is useful to mention?
No, I said yesterday that I thought that as time passed, he became too, I'd say, corrupted by power, not by money. I don't think he was venal. At one time I thought he was a good, efficient Prime Minister, but he never, as far as I know, stood up to the Shah. He just carried out the Shah's orders, and that suited the Shah very well. He was probably a very good administrator, and he was very good company too. I mean, I enjoyed him as somebody to talk to and so on. He was well read, he got good conversation and so on. But I never got onto really intimate terms with him, and it may be that, I mean, I knew that between him and Alam there was no great love lost, and so he knew I was close to Alam, so that probably acted as him. But I don't think he was particularly fond of the British. But if you go and see my friend Bernard Alexander, who lives nearby, he was very close to Hoveyda and had a very high opinion of him, because he was with him in the United Nations refugee organization, and I think you'll find him rather interesting on Hoveyda.
Is there any prominent Iranian which I haven't mentioned who should have been mentioned?
Can't think of anybody. I can't think of anybody who was Bagapiania, where we've just touched on. I mean, he was governor of Shiraz, and he fell out with Hoveyda, I think. Then he became governor of Khorasan, and I went up and spent 2 days with him, saying goodbye to him and so on. I always found him a very friendly, decent person to deal with, and I saw him the other day. He came through, he's got out of Iran, he's gone to America. I saw him in London. He was in fact, he was in hospital and quite seriously ill for a time. But Hassan Alavi was always ambitious to, and think that he was very friendly with the British for a time, because he had been trained by not Philip Neame, but Elizabeth Munro's husband, who was an eye specialist, and he would never charge any Britisher for any consultation, because he said he owed so much to the British. But I think he was disappointed in the British, because he had political ambitions and he never became Prime Minister, and so he switched to the Americans and became President of the yes. And I think the reason for that was that he had these political ambitions. I'm told he's coming to England any minute now. Did you know that?
No, I didn't.
And he was what I call one of the old school one used to see from time to time, and like I mentioned, Arab Shabani and Musavi, who was Abdullah Musafi, I think it was. But they were, in a way, they used to waste one's time. They used to come round and talk to one and grumble about things and want to know what the British thought about this and the other. But I always believed in seeing them, because they were sort of faithfuls, and they were the relics of the old Anglophils, and they weren't asking favours. I think they would just like to feel they had some sort of link with the British Embassy. And I think, I mean, this is stuff which is not going to be released, is it? But I think one of the faults of Tony Parsons was that he wouldn't have anything to do with these people, regarded them all as fossils. And I think that if he had paid more attention to some of these people, he would have had more sort of warnings that things were not well, because they were the people who, in my day, were grumbled about the Shah, and I used to champion the Shah and say, well, the Shah is doing this, that and the other, and used to rather stick up for the Shah. But I think they might have given him some sort of indication that things were far from well. No, I can't think of anybody else. The most ambitious and intriguing of all those people was Piraste, I think, who was an unscrupulous man. I think was responsible for getting Nafisi, Ahmed, put into prison, as I mentioned.
He was also reputed to have been close to Princess Ashraf.
Was he? Yes. Yes, so it could well be. Of course, Rahnama was a character who was close to Princess Ashraf. Majid, yes. And he got the money out of her for Wadham College, you see. I mean, this was done through that curious fellow Ishag, who was at Prem Ishag at Wadham. But Rahnama was, as I saw him in the embassy, was in many ways a sort of a lightweight chap who wasn't, I think the Iranians call him Mr. Afro-Asian, wasn't he? I mean, Mr. Afro-Asian. But he was a friend of Hoveyda's, wasn't he? And, yes. What other ministers were there then? Muzagar, yes, I had a high regard for Muzagar because I used to come across him when I was Under Secretary in the Foreign Office at the Baghdad PAC meetings and so on. And he was very able and good, and as Minister of Finance under Hoveyda, I had some problems over the British Council being taxed. I've forgotten what the things were, but there was quite a big issue about taxation of the British Council, and I went to Muzagar direct on this and argued the case and succeeded in getting whatever it was. I don't know whether it was complete exemption for taxation or getting, but anyway, there was he was very accommodating on that. So I never regarded him in my day, at any rate, as an American stooge. I mean, people have always said he was in American pay and so on, but I regarded him as a fairly forthright.
Was there no way that your intelligence people could tell you as a fact whether these rumors were true or not?
No.
They could.
But I don't think they were current in my day. I mean, it was after the balloon went up. I mean, it never occurred to me that he was an American agent or anything like that.
How about Ali Khani? Did you have any dealings with him?
Yes, so what I had, were quite satisfactory, except that I think when he was at the university, his niece had wanted a visa for England, and he sent her around and said she'd been refused a visa. When I went into it, of course, she'd been caught shoplifting in London, I mean, like many other Iranians, and I told Ali Khani, I said, I'm very sorry, I'm not going to give her a visa because she goes to England and does that. That's really not interesting. But apart from that, my dealings with Ali Khani were satisfactory. I don't think I had very much to do with him when he was Minister of Economy or anything. At the university, I had little to do with him. Hussein Nasr, I saw occasionally, Sirius Ghani, but I mean, they were all fringe people. They weren't.
How about the two newspaper editors, Masoudi and Nesbazadeh?
Well, Masoudi I got quite close to over the Bahrain. It was his initiative from his side, it wasn't mine. And I was very grateful to him for that. Nesbazadeh I never had very much to do with. I mean, he was, I don't know, one was slightly suspicious of him in some way, but we never had much to do with him. But he just tied up with the Thompson organization, I think. And I did go and spend a day or have lunch there just before I retired, I think, to go around the whole organization. But we had a press attaché, information officer we called him, I think, whose job was to keep in touch with these people, but I never attempted to get them to write articles this way or the other, except I did complain to Masoudi when there was a rather nasty article about the British over Persian Gulf. I've forgotten, but it was at a time when it was not very helpful, and I did go and see Masoudi and say that I thought this was pretty unfair and so on, and he made amends. He wrote an editorial, but likewise I had trouble with the Etalat when the Queen's birthday party. I didn't like photographers coming. I didn't want too much publicity for the British, and I didn't want photographers at the Queen. You see, most of the national days, everybody, the ambassadors, like to have pictures appearing in the papers and so on. And so I went to gatecrash this party, and I had them turned out, the people. And there was a nasty article in in the Tehran Journal about this and me, and I complained to Masudi. I said, "Oh, you know, this is monstrous. I mean, why?" And he did. He sent his son round to apologize to me and for this article. You could do things. I never made what I call an unreasonable demand on the papers, and I never tried to get them to put in, you might say, pro-British articles. My information officer, yes, we had our service. We sent out articles about this, that, and the other, and they published it. That was the job. But personally, I kept, you might say, aloof from the press. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't normally go for interviews with them, I mean, except at the very end when I let them come and interview me and so on. That's it. I did. There's probably an awful lot more.
Thank you for giving me 2 days of your time.
Not a bit, no. Well, thank you. I hope it's of some use.
I hope I'm still around at the time when these
come out. Yeah, well, you will be. Yeah.
End of tape number 8.